Do you remember Unus Annus?
That's not my eye.
I'm being hanged.
That was a mistake. I'm gonna fucking kill this.
Unus Annus, meaning 1 year in Latin, was a YouTube project created by Markiplier and Crank Gameplays, also known as Mark Fishbach and Ethan Nestor. The channel launched on November 15th, 2019 with a simple mission. They would upload a new video every day for a full year, and at the end of 365 days, they would delete the channel, removing all the videos permanently and leaving Unus Annus as only a memory for those who were there. It was a really novel concept, and Unus Annus quickly grew to over 4.5 million subscribers and 867 million views before the channel was officially deleted. The year went on as promised, and as promised, exactly 1 year later the channel was deleted, live on YouTube. It's been 5 years since the project began. It's difficult to describe the experience of being a part of Unus Annus in its heyday. There was a huge sense of community in knowing that this thing that we all loved was going to disappear, and furthermore, knowing exactly when. If you were an avid watcher, or maybe you've just seen someone in the wild wearing the merch, you might be familiar with the phrase Momento Mori, remember death. This was the slogan of Unus Annus' channel. We were often told to remember death, that death was inevitable, and it was ever approaching for the channel. What some may not know is that the concept of Memento Mori has existed throughout antiquity, and it has a very long history in the arts and culture. Unus Annus' branding was very in line with the classical iterations of the Memento Mori trope. All the symbols you would expect, bones, skulls, coffins, and some that are a little more niche, like hourglasses and wilting flowers. The concept has philosophical roots in classical antiquity. Democritus, a pre-Socratic philosopher, posited that the practice of philosophy was about nothing but death and dying. This idea was widespread. Meditating on death and remembering mortality was meant to create a sense of morality within a person. Though credited with the invention of the phrase, obviously, it's in Latin, Romans were more interested in the idea of carpe diem, or seizing the day, rather than remembering death. Their philosophy encouraged people to eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die. The use of the expression Memento Mori specifically grew alongside Christianity. The concepts of heaven, hell, and the afterlife in general were a further expansion on the earlier Roman idea. If one believes himself immortal, he can commit any number of horrendous acts without fear of final judgment. However, if he remembers death, his own death, he will know that one day he will be judged. He will be cautious, kind, and just. It was also a press for temperance when faced with mortal pleasures. No amount of food, drink, money, or sex will accompany you in the afterlife, but the weight of those sins will. Remember, you will die, and so behave accordingly. In Catholicism and other sects of Christianity, Ash Wednesday is a tradition where a priest sprinkles ashes on the forehead of the members of their congregations, specifically as a reminder of their own mortality. In biblical times, wearing ashes represented repentance, and it was accompanied by the dictum, "Remember that you are dust, and to dust you shall return." People have always wanted to remember death. It's strikingly prevalent across our lives. In the 14th century, a really fascinating trend emerged: cadaver tombs. These tombs had a life-size sculpture of the deceased, withered and decayed by time. These depicted the human body in the transition between life and death, but they were also a stark reminder of the impermanence of wealth. Even those with money and power will decay away. As these tombs were popularized, their sculptures became more gruesome, more detailed, more decayed, well into the putrefaction phase of decay. They were partially skeletonized and covered in extant life like worms, fungi, and rats. This trend peaked in the 16th century, though I would honestly like to bring it back for my funeral. I think it's really cool. There was a sub-trend that occurred as well, wherein the tomb would have two levels. On the higher one would be a sculpture of the deceased looking pristine as they did in life, and on the lower level would be their decayed self. This is a fascinating exploration of the passage of time through a singular sculpture. Cadaver tombs weren't the only representation of death at funerals. Puritans would have their tombstones carved with images of winged skulls or deathly skeletons snuffing out candlelight. Some chapels have walls that are covered in human remains, specifically bones. The Kapela dos Osos in the Czech Republic is particularly badass, with the following inscription over the door: "We bones, lying here bare, awaiting yours." Creepy. Memento Mori isn't simply about what happens after death. It's an idea that artists, writers, philosophers want us to be thinking about while we're alive. As stated, timepieces like hourglasses have been used as a symbol for this concept for ages, though as time has moved forward, so have the depictions. Public clocks are often inscribed with small messages like Ultima Forsan, meaning perhaps the last hour. Some clocks are striking clocks, meaning a little figure will ride along a mechanized track on the hour and strike a bell. These are called automata, and in Augsburg, Germany, Death himself would strike their clock. Even Mary, Queen of Scots, was remembering death. She had a large silver watch carved into a skull with an inscription, "Pale death knocks with the same tempo upon the huts of the poor and the towers of kings." People wore a type of ornament called death jewelry in the 16th and 17th centuries. One of the most interesting were mourning rings. These were worn in memory of someone who has died, bearing their name and the date of their death. They often had images of the same motifs as mentioned, skulls, bones, and coffins carved into the metal. What you might think of first when presented with the idea of Memento Mori is actually the artistic genre known as vanitas. Now, this is a Latin word that means vanity, but more contextually it represents pointlessness, futility, and inevitability, all concepts that are very tied in with Memento Mori. This micro-movement began in Leiden, Netherlands, in the 16th century and continued into the 17th century. Vanitas is very symbolic. Often each object in the painting will have allegorical or hidden meanings. Dutch painters of the time were very interested in this genre, often relating their work back to biblical teachings and the idea that all people will die. These paintings were extremely layered. They would include symbols of the arts, like musical instruments, symbols of sciences like maps and books, and symbols of wealth like purses or jewelry. They would also include symbols of debauchery like pipes and goblets. All of this ties into the central thesis that none of these things can follow you into the grave. Fascinatingly, and contrary to the central point of the Vanitas painting, some of these artworks would include a symbol of eternal life, like an ear of corn, a sprig of ivy, or a ring of laurel leaves. We can assume these are meant to be representations of eternal life in heaven, leaving these paintings with a more hopeful mood than some of the others of the genre. I've mostly focused on the ideas as presented through a Western lens thus far, but there are very similar ideas in Eastern philosophies as well. Buddhism has a practice called Marana Sati, which is a meditation on the idea that death can strike us at any time, and all people should remain diligent at every moment. This is meant to develop an urgency to advance spirituality. Some Buddhist monasteries have human skeletons in the meditation halls to draw on this principle. Monks are told to reflect on the possibilities of their own afterlife, and then utilize these feelings from that contemplation to abandon quote-unquote unskillful mental qualities. The remembrance of death is also a common topic in Islamic spirituality. The Quran encourages the current generation to pay heed to the fates of their predecessors. Hadith literature is the written accounts of oral traditions passed down from the Prophet Muhammad, and it's recorded in these documentations that believers are to remember often death, the destroyer of pleasures. In the 5th century, there was an Indian Buddhist philosopher named Buddhaghosa who put forth the idea that there are 8 different ways of meditating on death. 1. Meditating on death as a murderer. 2. Meditating on it as a ruin of success. 3. Viewing it by comparison with famous persons. 4. Meditating on the body as the abode of many, worms as well as others. 5. Meditating on the difficulty of keeping alive. 6. Meditating on it without occasion, since beings die unpredictably. 7. Meditating on the shortness of a lifetime. And 8. Meditating on the fact that the lifetime of a being is a single moment of consciousness, and that a consciousness dies every moment. What's really interesting about this list is that Unus Annus spends much of their videos unintentionally following each of the meditations on this list. 1. Death as a murderer. The first video that really comes to mind for this meditation is discussing the idea of murdering each other, but it's just a joke and definitely not serious, haha. Mark and Ethan, dressed head to toe in splatterproof clothing, stand in a room draped in plastic. It immediately creates the effect they're hoping it would, making this a discomforting kill room. Throughout the video, they discuss how they would kill their victim, demonstrating their attacks on the mannequin they made of themselves. Clearly, this is a meditation on death as a killer. How would one kill? How would one feel in the act of killing? How would one experience the sensory aspects of murder? Clearly, Mark and Ethan are not actually killers, but by placing themselves in the shoes of a would-be murderer, they are able to safely practice the feeling of violence without the sin, if that's how I want to label it. This kind of meditation on death can produce cathartic feelings, Faux vengeance mimics the feelings of real vengeance and allows us to release anger, resentment, and fear. Another video, Mark and Ethan Get Into a Fight, also meditates on this violence by allowing Mark and Ethan to faux attack each other through the experience of fight choreography for film and television. This is an interesting meditation to view through the lens of Unus Annus because Mark and Ethan don't make very many full videos meditating on the concept of being killers, and yet there are quite a few videos where the ending gag is that one of them killed the other. 2. Death as a ruination of success. I define this meditation as death being an interruption to success and an end to the ability to create further success, not as a fall from grace that would ruin a successful career. The video What Happens When a YouTube Channel Dies is slightly off the mark of this concept. Mark and Ethan in this video are exploring YouTube channels who haven't uploaded in several years and discussing what happened to them and the effects the disappearance had on the platform. Because these deaths are within their own career field, it subconsciously would cause Mark and Ethan to contemplate the mortality of their own careers, but it doesn't take the idea to the point of literal death. There's a few videos that I think illustrate this concept better. The first is making our own gravestones to prepare for our inevitable demise. This video, I would say, primarily suits this meditation for Mark, but it suits the next meditation for Ethan. I'll explain further in a moment, but let's talk about Mark first. He creates a tombstone of himself surrounded by money and a diamond play button. In doing so, he's specifically tying the idea of his legacy in with his success. Yes, it's obviously meant to be a joke, but jokes don't come from thin air. Whether Mark understood that this was what he was doing or not, he meditated on how his death would affect his success and vice versa, how his success would impact his death. If we contemplate the death of the channel rather than the death of the body, I might argue that the set of videos You Blink You Lose and You Breathe You Die are a meditation on the ruination of success. These were contest-style videos where Mark and Ethan were competing either to not blink first or to hold their breath the longest, and the winner would be allowed to delete a video from the loser's main channel. Each of them won one contest, and so each man lost millions of views from their channel. I would say that that counts as a ruination of success on a micro level. 3. Death in comparison to famous persons. I promised I would explain how Ethan's contemplation differs from Mark's in the gravestone video, and I will. In that video, Ethan's tombstone depicts a photo of Mark with a very blurry image of Ethan in the background. I'm not trying to be mean when I say that Markiplier is much more famous than Ethan, and Ethan is very aware of this, which is obviously what makes this joke funny. I don't know why I'm trying to explain comedy to you. I don't know. But it's true that many people think of Ethan as Mark's friend. So Ethan is often framed in comparison to a famous person. He would reasonably contemplate his death in relation to Mark. This idea of Ethan's fame in comparison to Mark's is further emphasized in the video Mark and Ethan Bet Everything on a Wikipedia Race. At the end of the video, Mark looks up Unus Annus and it redirects to Markiplier's own Wikipedia page. Then he looks up Crank Gameplays, Ethan's channel name at the time, and there is no page for his channel. The first suggested result is Markiplier.
I looked up Unus Annus, it just redirects to Markiplier.
To be in a world where I had my own identity.
Crank Gameplays does not exist.
On Wikipedia?
The first suggested is Markiplier.
When will I be my own person?
Meditation on Ethan's life, career, and ultimately death in relation to a famous person. I don't recall an instance of Mark himself meditating on his own death in comparison to a famous person. Maybe in the video, Will AI Soon Take Over Humanity as We Know It, when he and Ethan discuss the idea of using CGI to bring dead celebrities back to life to act in more movies. He expresses a level of disgust with the idea, so it might be reasonable to assume he was thinking about his own image being brought back after his death. If that was the case, I believe it's a reasonable assumption that he would not be okay with it. That's me doing a bit of speculation, but I don't think it's unreasonable speculation, and that's the only real instance I can think of Mark in Unus Annus meditating on his death in relation to a more famous person. 4. The body as the abode of many. This one makes me feel a little personally icky. It is a meditation on your body as a home to microorganisms or detrivores like earthworms, both in life and in death. They made a video called This is Hiding on Your Body Right Now, where they used a bacteria science kit to examine which parts of their body housed the most bacteria. They would, for example, lick the agar plates and then leave it to grow bacteria for a while, and then they would examine it and see what grew. What better contemplation of the body as an abode to many? We all have billions of microorganisms living on our skin and in our body, and seeing them visually definitely creates feelings Whether those feelings are positive or negative are irrelevant. What's important is that both Mark and Ethan and the audience are forced to contend with their body as a host. There are a few smaller examples I can think of. In their video, Reddit 50/50, 2-player edition, they're confronted with images of maggots on someone's foot, a body that hosts the worms. Or in We Bought a Camera That Can Look Inside Us, both Mark and Ethan express fear and trepidation over the idea that there could be bugs, specifically spiders, living in their ear canals.
What are you hoping not to find?
I
don't want to find.
If some fucking moving in there, I don't want
Yeah.
to see anything moving. I hope to Christ we don't see a bug in there.
In Mark and Ethan Go Casket Shopping, Mark asks the guest about people who want to be preserved in hardwood caskets versus those who want to be returned to the earth and eaten by worms.
I would think that, if someone was getting buried versus cremated, some people might want a wood that would rot away so that their body can return to the earth, in that fashion.
It's obvious that this is a somewhat universal contemplation that people have when thinking about death, but I think it's one that makes people more uncomfortable than others. Like if I told you right now that you have mites on your eyelashes, that they're healthy for you and you can't get rid of them, that would make most people uncomfortable. We don't like to think that something could inhabit our bodies without our knowledge or without our consent. However, we don't really get a say in what happens to our remains beyond the preparation of your body after death. You can't tell the earth not to swallow you into it eventually. 5. The difficulty of keeping alive. I would argue that there's essentially 2 genres of videos for this meditation. The first are the self-care videos that were made for Unus Annus. This includes videos like purging our sins with the neti pot, professional fire cupping, going even further beyond, and preserving ourselves in wax. While I do believe I could make an argument that these videos fall under the umbrella of meditating on the difficulty of keeping alive, I believe these are more about the difficulty of keeping healthy, which is not necessarily the same thing. If you think it is, however, I don't think I feel strongly enough about it to die on this hill. In my opinion, the video Middle School Science Experiment Teaches Us About Life and Death is a much better example of this rumination. Mark and Ethan dissect owl pellets, which are a ball of undigested matter that owls will regurgitate after digestion. These pellets are mostly made of fur, but they can also contain other materials, like bones. There's a strong message in this video about the life cycle of animals and the difficulty of staying alive for both creatures. The rodents that make up the bones in these pellets wanted to stay alive, but so did the owl. Every day there's a push and pull between the prey animal and the predator, and one of them has to die. The other video in which I can really see this meditation is Whom Would Eat Whomst First in a Zombie Apocalypse. This was one of the first quarantined Unus Annus videos, and so Mark and Ethan decided to take a quiz about surviving the zombie apocalypse. The quiz included questions about all kinds of survival skills, from combat experience and weapons to medical supplies and judgment. In answering these questions, Mark and Ethan are forced to examine all the factors that keep them alive, and contemplate the difficulty of surviving without convenient access to survival materials. Is there any scenario more difficult to survive than an apocalypse? I don't think so. 6. Without occasion. Arguably, Unus Annus participates in this meditation all of the time. Many videos end with Mark and Ethan being killed right before the clock appears, whether this is by each other's hand or something like a trolley in the ultimate trolley problem.
Coming! It's too late!
The sun in What Does Astrology Say About Our Friendship?
Oh look, it's the sun coming to burn us away.
Or Shaq's big toe in WikiFeet, A Tale of Two Tootsies.
Shaq's big toe!
No!
Coming right at us!
No!
No!
I'm not even sure how much detail I need to go into with this meditation. This is what the channel is about. 7. The shortness of a lifetime. There are a surprising number of videos covering the length of the human experience from Unus Annus, beginning with birth. In We Tried a Labor Pain Simulator, they tried a labor pain simulator. Sometimes the titles are just obvious, guys. In Recreating the Miracle of Childbirth, Mark and Ethan try to recreate the experience of being in the womb followed by being born. Neither of these videos are particularly serious.
Spank me.
But it's interesting that in contemplating their own deaths and the death of their channel, they are also compelled to explore the beginnings of life. It does make sense that in considering the end, people would want to go back to the beginning. Birth isn't the only life phase being contemplated, however. Puberty Simulator is a video where Mark attempts to take Ethan back to the feelings of growing into an adolescent, from hair growth to acne. It's a strong transitional phase in our lives that is generally unpleasant, and arguably a moment in time many would rather forget. Instead, Unus Annus would rather re-experience it. Why? Perhaps it's an argument about the precious moments in our past that we don't acknowledge. Yeah, it's a comedy video, I know. But puberty is a fairly universal experience for humans, and looking back on it as an adult does make me acknowledge that I have grown older. I've changed from who I was back then. I feel different. I look different. I am not my middle school self. Not only does Unus Annus reflect on past human experiences, but it imagines future ones. In Geriatric Simulator, Mark and Ethan gather supplies to create an old age suit. This suit limits mobility, vision, and flexibility, creating the experience of the difficulty we have as we age. Ethan comments that he hopes this isn't what old age is like because
This fucking blows, dude.
luckily for them, Mark and Ethan are many years away from being old, but in experiencing the physical limitations of the elderly, they gained a new appreciation for their youth. As Ethan says, don't take your tightness for granted. 8. A consciousness dies every moment. I believe this is the most abstract of the meditations. It's not referring to the fact that in every moment a consciousness across the planet is dying, though that is true as well. This is referring to the fact that every moment is a moment that you are conscious, and with each passing second, the person you were in the last second is dead. You are not exactly the same consciousness you were as when I began this sentence. This is the meditation that Unus Annus is about at its core. If you watch a YouTube video as a freshman in high school, age 14, and then 4 years later you watch it as you graduated high school, you would have a different experience. Your consciousness has changed, even if you didn't notice it changing over the years. Unus Annus doesn't want you to get that experience. Unus Annus asked you to experience the videos as the consciousness you were at the time. Your feelings and thoughts around the project can evolve, but the experiences can never be the same, so why try to pursue them again? It appears that most cultures, and especially religions, press the importance of death as a way to maintain purity of the soul. It feels weird to tie these ancient thoughts and feelings to a single YouTube channel from 5 years ago, but the core of these feelings echoes through the idea of Unus Annus. It wasn't about purity of the soul, exactly, but purity of creation. Unus Annus was created partially in response to the growing demonetization of creators across YouTube. Videos were becoming more corporate, more expensive, and more brand and advertiser friendly. I can draw a comparison to the sins these philosophies were trying to abate: greed, flattery, obscuration. Unus Annus, in remembering that the channel wouldn't last forever, was able to reach for a truth that YouTube hadn't experienced in years. It was the pure spirit of creation that allowed Unus Annus to make a deeper connection and impact on the audience. Because of the lack of obfuscation, audiences were able to feel that these ideas were real. Because of the lack of corporate interest, viewers were allowed to relax rather than being sold something. Because of the lack of permanence, Mark and Ethan were willing to try, confess, fail, laugh, cry, and embarrass themselves. And that emotional honesty is something we all crave. But what happens when things refuse to end, or end far beyond their time? Let's talk about it. Franchise fatigue and cancellation. Man, I am so sick of everything being rebooted. I'm actually incensed by things like the live-action Avatar: The Last Airbender show. I hated every single one of the Disney live-action reboots. I'm tired of the Indiana Jones movies, the Star Wars series, and the superhero shows, and I know I'm not the only one. Part of the reason people are falling away from these stories is the cinematic universe craze. It really started with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and I firmly believe the MCU has been the only franchise to really pull it off. In being acquired by Disney, however, there was a series of crucial mistakes. It can all really be boiled down to Disney+. I was a pretty big Marvel movie fan, and even though I'm someone who's pretty unlikely to go to a movie theater, I would almost always go out for whatever the Marvel movie of the summer was. This worked for the most part until Endgame. I saw Endgame in theaters, and I completely loved it. Everyone saw it. It was a cultural moment. And then WandaVision came out, and I watched WandaVision, and I thought it was just okay. And then I watched Falcon and the Winter Soldier, and then I watched Loki Season 1, and then I watched The Eternals, all on Disney+, and then I stopped watching. Disney and Marvel had stopped asking for 4 hours of my time every year. Instead, they were asking for triple that every few weeks. They wanted subscribers to Disney+, and to do that, they created content for their platform, obviously. However, in a connected world like the MCU, it became a chore to keep up with the amount of homework you had to do to watch the mainline series. I stopped watching the MCU altogether because I felt like I was missing out when I did go to the theaters. People don't want to have to watch 3 movies and a TV series just to understand what's going on in your big summer blockbuster. It's confusing and frustrating, and the more times that happens, the more likely people will stop engaging with the content. content. Unus Annus is a singular art project, however. Any viewer could join the ride at any time they wanted, and it was very accessible to them. There are references to other videos in some productions, but they never take away from the main point of each video. You don't have to understand the Unus Annus cinematic universe to watch the goat yoga video and have a fun experience. This is because Unus Annus is extremely episodic, not serialized like narrative television. I find it personally interesting that one of the reasons people dislike reboots is that it essentially wipes the slate clean, when I'm arguing that Unus Annus did this in a positive way. The reason people dislike this form of reboot actually comes down to a few factors. 1. Does the new piece of media fundamentally change anything about beloved characters? 2. Does this reboot make the previous media meaningless? And 3. Does this reboot understand the world and themes of the original? I'm sure several pieces of media came to mind for each question. When it comes to narrative works, people want to maintain their reasons for loving the media, and studios can interpret that very differently. Maybe the studio thought you loved a movie because of the epic action scenes, but really you loved the chemistry between the team. So when the studio reboots the series with a new cast and 50% more action, you're going to feel a disconnect from the franchise you enjoyed. This is arguably what happened with the Ghostbusters reboot. Sure, people liked a movie about ghost hunters, but beneath the surface what they really enjoyed was the combination of comedy styles of the actors in the original. How Unus Annus differs, though, is that there is nothing attempting to change your memories of the series. If Unus Annus was rebooted with 2 different YouTubers at the helm, people would hate it because the established characters and character dynamic of the show would have changed drastically. If Unus Annus was rebooted but it was going on for 5 years instead of 1, people would hate it because it thematically doesn't mean the same. People want to maintain their feelings about a franchise, and that's incredibly hard to recapture. It's interesting to note the conflict between the 2 previous reasons for reboot fatigue. It is simultaneously true that series with long and extensive histories are intimidating to new audiences, and that rebooting the series to wipe the slate clean alienates the current fans of the property. In my opinion, the issue is with the iconic nature of the franchises being rebooted. Even though the Harry Potter movies were coming out in theaters when I was still a bit too young to go see them, I still grew up on those movies. I've seen every single one at least a few times. I've been to the theme park, I own some merchandise, I know I'm a Ravenclaw, and I know that my Patronus is a mole. Don't laugh, it's not funny. I'm not a Harry Potter millennial, but I am very aware of the franchise, and so in trying to reboot it as a TV show, Hollywood is alienating me hard, as well as the millions of other Harry Potter fans. The movies are not obscure or hard to find or of a really poor quality. Some of the special effects have aged a bit poorly, but there is no reason that a 35-year-old wouldn't show their child the DVD collection of Harry Potter movies, as opposed to waiting for the new show to come out, if it even gets to run to completion without being cancelled. There's no guarantee of that these days. Reboots are generally the most effective when a character's history has become too confusing and contradictory to have a satisfying story continuity. This is why you'll often see reboots within comic media. I'm gonna give you a history lesson. Okay, ready? We're gonna dive right in. The beginning of people really talking about reboots explicitly as a term in relation to film franchises was Batman Begins in 2005. This was followed pretty closely by Casino Royale in 2006 as a reboot of the James Bond film franchise. Bond and Batman both present a really interesting front for the birth of film reboots. There had already been several Bonds by the time Casino Royale came out, and these largely work because Bond isn't a dynamic character for the most part. These are not movies that are meant to explore any deep inner world that the spy had. They were extremely episodic action movies with little to no overarching story. I could jump right into the Bond franchise whenever I liked, and I would have no trouble understanding Bond as a character or the movie as a film. Batman is similarly framed. He's obviously a more literal translation between comics and films, though before Batman Begins, there were several Batman movies, from Batman and Robin to the Tim Burton's Batman. Similarly to Bond, though, Batman was a static character. He was a crime fighter, and whatever movie he was in was more externally focused on defeating the bad guy and getting whatever girl than exploring him as a deeper, more motivated character. Batman Begins essentially spawned a huge amount of reboots. The Nightmare on Elm Street, Halloween, and Planet of the Apes franchises all specifically tied back to the success of the newest Batman installment at the time. Multiple directors and actors made an exact comparison. For example, Daniel Craig, the new Bond actor, said, "You've got to put the suit on and get it right." Christian Bale did it in Batman Begins. Samuel Bayer also held Batman's director Christopher Nolan up as an example of what he wanted with the Nightmare on Elm Street reboot, saying, "I told all my cast and crew that we must do with Freddy what Christopher Nolan did with Batman. I'm trying to make a dark and serious film, and I hope I'm from achieving that. The negative attitude that current audiences experience about reboots wasn't really around at that point. People were enjoying the movies that were being rebooted, even if they didn't reach the same critical reception as the original. What turned people's opinions, oddly enough, was another superhero movie. Sam Raimi was the director of a Spider-Man trilogy beginning in 2002 and ending with Spider-Man 3 in 2007. It's honestly super iconic, and many people consider it the revitalization of the superhero genre on film. It's basically what made the MCU possible. But the issue wasn't with Sam Raimi's Spider-Man. In 2012, the Spider-Man film franchise would be rebooted as The Amazing Spider-Man only 5 years after the ending of the past franchise. This was primarily, to my knowledge, to retain Sony's control over Spider-Man adaptations on the silver screen. After that, usage of the word reboot and the concept in the consciousness of the public became more widespread. People began to view it as creatively bankrupt or a money grab rather than a pleasant nostalgia trip. I should note that I'm using the term reboot very loosely, and the author of the book I'm referencing would probably fight me in a Denny's parking lot over it. His name is William Proctor, and as all academics do, he loves defining the terms on which he's speaking. Proctor makes a distinct difference between the terms reboot, remake, revival, retcon, and spin-off. Yes, obviously all of these terms are different and have their nuances. Proctor describes something like The Force Awakens as a continuation. There, I specified. Please don't come kick my ass, Proctor. I'm just a little YouTube guy. Please. If you want to read Proctor's book or any of the resources I'm referencing for this video, there is a link in the description below to a paste bin that has all of the resources where I got my my academic papers, so definitely go check those out. Check out Proctor. His book is good. Proctor, I'm sorry. I'm sorry that I'm calling it a reboot. I'm sorry. Okay. I can't actually finish talking about this topic without discussing 9/11. Not really, but I thought this was interesting. Proctor talks a lot about the differences between the 2002 Bond movie Die Another Day and the 2006 Casino Royale. Die Another Day was a commercial success, but it wasn't an artistic success. Executive producers felt like the series had become too cartoonish, and audiences were looking for darker, more grim, authentic, or realistic stories. They specifically felt that because 9/11 happened, it wasn't responsible or sensitive to have Bond fight silly terroristic threats anymore. It makes total sense, but I also didn't see it coming at all. The realism angle worked well for all three Nolan Batman films, but faltered heavily when Man of Steel was released. People didn't like seeing Superman framed as just another Batman-type character. Then of course we had Batman v Superman. If you don't remember that time, Ben Affleck was cast to play Batman, and there was an immediate fan backlash. Lots of people believed that Affleck wasn't intimidating enough to play Batman, and whether this had anything to do with the final product or not is entirely up to debate. But Affleck's Batman was darker, more violent, and more real than ever. There's a sincere possibility that to prove that Affleck was a tough enough Batman, they leaned harder into the violence. Justice League was kind of the nail in the coffin for Batfleck, and then next up was Robert Pattinson himself. It's fascinating the impact that Nolan's Batman had on Batman's legacy because, again, the Batman is trying to recapture that same feeling. It wanted to capture the same Bruce Wayne, the same Alfred, the same Gotham, and to do so, they think they need to go even darker. Director Matt Reeves described The Batman as almost a horror movie, and early critics compared it to other films like Seven, Manhunter, and even Saw. This is all nostalgia baiting, in my opinion. Batman Begins and the subsequent Nolan Batman films captured attention because they were some of the first in their genre. Every subsequent Batman thinks if they just do the voice and have the cool gadgets and make Batman brood on a rooftop in the rain, they've got it locked down. I can tell you, from my own personal perspective, that I've seen each of these films once. The only thing I remember from The Batman was that one TikTok sound with the song Ave Maria. And I liked The Batman. I thought it was good, but it wasn't mimetically distinct from the rest of the brooding bats in my mind. I do remember a lot about the Nolan Batman films. It's not your imagination that there are more reboots than ever before. Within the horror genre, there have been more than 45 reboots in the 2010s compared to like 10 in the 2000s and 1990s. This is because of exactly what you think it's because of: brand recognition. There's a term called pre-sold products. You recognize the Scream mask, right? Maybe you like Scream a whole lot. You're already sold sold on the concept, so you're considered an extremely valuable consumer. You don't feel as much pressure walking into a Scream movie because you've already liked one before. The studio doesn't have to work as hard to convince you to go either. This is also why we see horror movies about media that has entered the public domain, like the Winnie the Pooh horror movie Blood and Honey or the Mickey Mouse horror movie Mousetrap. A lot of the papers I've been reading on the topic frame rebooting as a good thing. It's a chance for a writer, filmmaker, whatever, to put their stamp on an iconic franchise. Some of them frame fans as a problem with a desire to hold franchises to an established canonicity. I think this is such a weird way to frame things. It's giving very business bro energy. This is a great way to make lots and lots of money. Take something a lot of people love, make a mediocre product, and change a lot of the things they like, but don't worry, they're gonna see it in theaters, and if they don't like it, too bad. You already have their money. Plus, they still buy keychains and backpacks because they like the iconography we loosely used in this film. I am so smart. In a paper reimagining the canon, examining the discourse of contemporary horror film reboots, the author is arguing that the Halloween 2007 reboot by Rob Zombie was a great way to reboot the franchise and explore a new route that hadn't been in the original movie. But people and critics did not like Halloween 2007. It's got like a 28% on Rotten Tomatoes and like a 59% audience score. The author argues that it doesn't matter if the film was good or bad, it matters that it boosted brand recognition. Imagine thinking about people like that, about art like that. How strange. This is just kind of turning into my own personal gripes at this point. Maybe I will fight Proctor in that parking lot. I believe that the constant rebooting, reviving, rewriting, and continuing of franchises creating a sense of malaise in media consumers. Oh, Ghostface is back this year? I saw him get killed last year, and 2 years ago, and 4 years ago. There's another Star Wars show? Maybe I'll put it in the background as I clean. Did you know there's a really interesting term in Hollywood right now to refer to shows as like second screen compatible? This is the idea that consumers aren't going to be paying 100% attention to the show on the TV in front of them. They're probably going to be scrolling on social media at the same time. People have theorized that this is why dialogue and exposition in new shows has been so bad recently, because executives assume that people aren't paying attention. They need to tell you what has just happened again and again. I know that's kind of a tangent, but why are we scrolling in the first place? Maybe it's because we're not emotionally invested because we know there's just going to be another Marvel show coming out next month. I read a paper called Engineering Consent, and I know that sounds really suspicious, but I promise it's not. It was basically about how politicians can vote as a proxy for their constituents with their consent. It didn't have very much to do with the topics I was researching, but I did find this quote very interesting. Primarily, however, the engineer of consent must create news. News is not an inanimate thing. It is the overt act that makes news, and news in turn shapes the attitudes and actions of people. I think I can argue that Hollywood is creating reboots to create news. What do you think is going to get more attention online? Disney reboots Frozen, their biggest franchise of all time, or new Disney project based on the fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel? Obviously the first one. It sparks outrage, it makes you upset. They need news and recognizable brands because audiences don't trust them, but we're in a vicious cycle. I don't trust them because of the lack of closure on projects. The lack of closure within media isn't a hugely new phenomenon. Daytime soap operas are notorious for their lack of narrative closure. Some say that the purpose of a soap is to never end. In Mumford's 1994 paper about soap operas, she posits 4 levels of closure that can potentially occur in regards to television. First, there's the concept of full closure, which would be the cancellation of a program. While this is technically the most full and final version of closure, it's not necessarily the most emotionally satisfying for an audience. Second, there's instances of total resolution. These are instances that are impossible to deny. For example, if there's a murder plot and the victim is identified as on-screen dead, that's an indisputable and definitive closure of that character and their storyline. Next is something called a snare. This is a kind of faux closure that's meant to intentionally deceive the audience. This is like your classic soap opera twist. Perhaps the body in our murder mystery was misidentified and the real character was alive the whole time. There's also something called equivocation, which is decidedly more ambiguous. So, keeping with our scenario, perhaps our unlucky victim is pushed off a bridge and into the river below. No body is ever found, but they are presumed dead. This both creates the possibility for the closure of a storyline and also creates an opening for a continuation. Finally, there's the series-style closure, where an overarching storyline comes to an end. Mumford has a really interesting quote about the way narrative closure is typically present in Hollywood. Analyses of the realist tradition of classic Hollywood cinema have often maintained that conventional closure works to reinforce reinforce dominant ideology at the levels of both content by shutting off alternative futures that might disrupt the status quo, and structure by insisting on a linear understanding of experience, promoting the notion of tidy solutions and forcing viewers to accept a single interpretation of fictional events. I find this interesting within the context of internet media versus traditional Hollywood framing that is often the center of discourse on YouTube. This interpretation implies that Unus Annus is a return to the traditional, and I can't say that's incorrect. In some ways, it did feel more like the traditional structure of a television show, receiving one season before being cancelled and taken off the air. It's even more traditional in the sense that there is no preservation of it. Without things like DVD box sets, traditional television shows became lost media when taken off the air. In the age of streaming and instant accessibility to basically any media you want, it's odd to be faced with the more traditional sense of loss of a TV show. Another quote I quite liked and thought prescient. Soap opera viewers are no doubt typical in negotiating between their curiosity about what will happen next and their understanding, gathered through experience of the form and the individual program, that certain outcomes are more likely than others. In relation to viewing Unus Annus, it's true that many viewers continued to tune in both out of curiosity and comfort with what we'd find next. There was never any indication of what video might be coming next, yet we know Ethan and Mark. We know their personalities and their sense of humor, so our intrigue was balanced with our trust in them as creators. The likely outcome was that we would laugh, but it wasn't a guarantee. There was also a most active subset of the fandom that was experiencing the fear of missing out on any challenges that might pop up in the videos. But in the end, it ended. Palmer summarizes a major school of thought when he describes it as the place where meaning of events becomes fixed. No closure, no fixing of meaning. And Frederick Jameson suggests how far that fixing may go when he writes, not only does the denouement stand as the reified end in view of which the rest of the narrative is consumed, this reifying structure also reaches down in the very page-by-page detail of the book's consumption. In other words, the closural moment does not merely fix a text's meaning, it endows all that preceded it with a retrospective meaning, refiguring the entire text in terms of its ending, which now assumes a degree of inevitability it may or may not have possessed. I find the ending of this quote especially poignant. The closural moment does not merely fix a text's meaning, it endows all that preceded it with retrospective meaning, which now assumes a degree of inevitability. What a perfect way to describe Unus Annus. The ending is what gave the video's meaning, and while it was always inevitable, the ending truly solidified that inevitability. In a paper by Russell and Shao called When Narrative Brands End, the authors believe there are two critical losses associated with the end of a narrative: the loss of narrative evolution and the loss of consumption sociality. What's interesting about Unus Annus in comparison to a typical television show is that TV wants to create a sense of the future, of existence of yet unwritten events. Unus Annus does this as well, but on a micro scale instead of a macro one. While the channel was live, there's the unwritten future videos, but the channel never wanted to create a future beyond November 14th, 2020. We were told over and over not to hope for more. The ending of the channel didn't necessarily mean the end of the relationship with the narrative brand. In the field of death studies, it's argued that relationships continue after they end. So adapting to a loss isn't the severance of a bond, but instead the establishment of a changed bond. I think the ending of Unus Annus was quite different in reaction than that of other narratives. Studies show that narratability is the dividing factor on whether someone is angry that a television show was cancelled or not. If a show has exhausted all reasonable avenues for which the story could take place, then fans are more likely to agree that a show should end while it's still ahead. But if audiences perceive more routes the narrative could explore, they're generally more upset. Specifically, there's an expression of anger. If we take the concept of narratability to Unus Annus, we would expect more anger at its cancellation. It's a concept that has essentially infinite narratability, but there was very little anger within the grieving process. Because of the pre-established deadline, there was an emphasis on the end. It created an anticipation for the ending rather than a grief. Hence, we find that the loss is based not on the series itself, but on what it meant to the person and to the social network that surrounded the consumption experience, and at a broader level still, the cultural meaning that the active brand represented. Assuming that narrative closure can be reached, the consumers can transform their relationship with the live brand into a relationship with a symbol of the brand. Collecting paraphernalia and creating mementos provide linking objects that both acknowledge the brand's death death and offer a continuing emotional connection to it. In a way, even though the narratability was near infinite, audiences were able to reach that sense of closure and respond positively. We'll talk a little bit more about closure in general later in this video. There are generally 3 ways for a consumer to end up at the end of a narrative consumption: complete decathexis, continuing brand bonds, and maladaption. Decathexis is total withdrawal, and the consumers remove the brand from their identity. This can eventually make the brand culturally irrelevant. Continuing the brand bond is basically exactly what it sounds like. Consumers can reconsume the media or purchase merchandise, and this pulls the brand further inward, creating a version of the media intertwined with personal memory. This is especially common in brands with wide cultural embrace, so things like Lord of the Rings. Maladaption is generally considered the worst way for fans to react to a cancellation. It represents denial, repression, and avoidance of all aspects of the loss and pain associated with the end of a show. Think of the end of BBC's Sherlock. People were straight up conspiracy theorists about the last season of that show. Consumers are unable to neutralize the emotional attachment they have to the brand, and so it takes much longer to adapt to the loss. Unus Annus fans, in general, have adapted by continuing brand bonds. People still wear their merch, and they still make Unus Annus compilations on social media. I don't think I've ever gone a week on TikTok without seeing something Unus Annus related. Even though the brand doesn't have broad cultural recognition, it has very strong niche recognition. I read a fairly interesting article about quantifying nostalgia by Jacobson and Beer. They were writing about it within the context of how social media has become a memory bank for many people, but social media is also public, meaning that other people can engage with your memories. You can quantify moments and memories by the amount of likes or whatever engagement they get. Again, I'm not an academic, but to my understanding, the quantification of nostalgia can also be driven by profit. Companies can chart on a spreadsheet exactly how much your nostalgia is worth in relation to releasing a reboot. Nostalgia is a funny thing. We've all experienced the longing to go back to a simpler time, but there's a very interesting phenomena that happens within it. People are lonely these days, lonelier than ever. There have been many theorized reasons for this loneliness, from social media to lack of third spaces to politics. But what is quantifiable is that loneliness causes a perceived lack of social support. Obviously, when you're lonely, you feel alone. Good one, Plague. You're so smart. I have a point, actually. Listen to the results of a 2008 study on nostalgia by Zhao et al. However, the indirect effect of loneliness is to increase perceived social support via nostalgia. The lonelier one feels, the more nostalgic one becomes, and the more social support one consequently perceives. This feeling of loneliness was exacerbated by the pandemic, and so was our desire for the past. People were consuming media that was nostalgic for them because there were very few new productions released in quarantine. YouTube and Twitch also saw a huge boost in viewership because they were one of the few industries who were able to keep making content. Unus Annus was a return in many ways to YouTube videos that were made in 2012 and 2015. Less budget, less production, less moderation, with more authenticity, more community, and more uniqueness. They were perfectly positioned for when the pandemic hit. I know Unus Annus helped me immensely during the lockdown. In our current media landscape, it feels impossible to get closure sometimes. YouTubers will disappear with no indication if they'll ever be back. TV shows will be greenlit for a season, and people will become invested in a project that's cruelly ripped away from them by executives before it can come to any conclusions. Franchises we thought were long dead and concluded are exhumed from their resting places to be made up and paraded around anew, even if they're rotting and falling apart. I'm tired. I'm tired of this lack of closure. I'm tired of getting my hopes up and being disappointed. I'm tired of hearing about another reboot, sequel, prequel. I'm tired of the capitalistic society that demands ever-increasing profits at the expense of truly fantastic art. In these times, where I'm avoiding getting invested in the new show of the year, I find myself looking back fondly on Unus Annus. We saw something through from start to finish, always knowing when it was going to end, and thus appreciating every moment we were given along the way. We collectively went through the 5 stages of grief, and though at the time a small part of my soul wished they would continue the project, with the benefit of hindsight, I'm happy we got to say goodbye to Unus Annus when we did. Closure. That's the word. Closure. Closure was initially something much different than how we think of the concept today. In the early 20th century, it was a way to describe how humans will naturally complete incomplete figures. So for example, if I drew an incomplete circle, your brain is fairly likely to imagine it as a complete circle, and you can even perceive that you saw the circle as a complete shape. The definition evolved in the 1990s to apply to more emotional psychological processes. Closure in a psychological sense can also be called NFC, need for closure, or NFCC, need for cognitive closure. It's generally related to our desires for firm, concrete answers in the face of ambiguity. Now, it's described as a need, but obviously it's not a need in the same sense as food or water. It's more like here on the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. The reason we feel like we need closure is so that we can predict the world more easily and respond to it more quickly. The 5 ways that NFCC manifests are typically as follows. 1. A preference for order. 2. A preference for predictability. 3. Discomfort with ambiguity. 4. Closed-mindedness, but not necessarily in the way you're thinking. This is more associated with the need to secure knowledge and avoid challenges to our knowledge. And 5. Decisiveness. Now, I'm going to introduce you to 2 people who have written about this extensively, both together and separately. The first is a guy named Kruglenski. Kruglenski, we stan Kruglenski. He has been working in this field for like 25 years, so a ton of my research came from him. And then he also has a partner, Webster. Kruglenski and Webster write together a lot. They both write about this topic a lot. Webster is a woman, by the way. She's great as well. But I'm a Kruglenski stan now. Every single paper I read about this topic was talking about the precedent that Kruglenski set. So shout out Kruglenski. I'm sorry if I'm saying your name wrong. Shout out. Need for closure is directly related to the intolerance of ambiguity, because ambiguity, by its very nature, threatens closure. Unus Annus had absolutely zero ambiguity when it came to closure. They told audiences the exact moment of the end, and there was never any hope given to the contrary. In fact, they constantly reminded audiences that once time was up, the channel would be gone forever. Something else I find quite interesting is the need for closure and its association for the desire for structure. According to a paper by Kruglenski and Webster in 1994, there's a positive correlation between the two. And while this is more loosely related, I do think it relates back to appeasing the kind of audience that Unus Annus would attract. It stands to reason that a project like Unus Annus would be extremely attractive to people with a high need for cognitive closure, but it was also extremely structured. A new video would hit sub boxes every single day for a year. This is extremely regular for a YouTube channel, and it does create a strong sense of structure. Additionally, each video would begin and end with the same ticking clock, reinforcing not only the structure of the channel, but the structure of individual videos within the channel. I just thought that was cool. In her book, Closure, The Rush to End Grief and What It Costs Us, Nancy Byrne describes 6 types of closure, and once again, Unus Annus hits almost all of these in various videos. They are as follows. 1. Closing a chapter. This is when some aspect of a traumatic event is wrapped up, often with a ritual that symbolizes an end, allowing a person to begin the next chapter. For example, a funeral. It symbolizes closing the chapter of someone's death and allowing us to move on. For our Unus Annus example, we can look at the paintball saga. In the video, Mark reviews the impossible whopper, but there's a looming sense of impending doom. Ethan is firing paintballs at Mark's back. When Ethan accidentally fires 2 paintballs instead of 1, Mark becomes enraged and demands that Ethan is shot once.
Get up there! I'm gonna fucking shoot you! Get the fuck up there!
Instead of being shot at that time, they make a deal that someday in the future, Ethan will be shot with a paintball. This was a running joke and a threat hanging over Ethan's head for over a month. But finally, in the video, Ethan finally becomes a man. Mark shoots him with the paintball. This closed the paintball saga, and we experienced the closing of this chapter. Another example was the chapter of Quarantanus, or the Unus Annus quarantine. This chapter ended with the infamous pee sauna video, and I am not going to go in any further detail for that. 2. Remembering. This one is specifically in relation to the fear of forgetting. So if you have a loved one who died and you're worried about forgetting them, you can get a memorial tattoo as a way to permanently remember. The most relevant video for this type of closure would be Unus Annus's time capsules that they made in a video titled Do Not Open Until 2080. Mark and Ethan each built a time capsule filled with mementos from their time doing the channel together and a note to their future self about the project and their feelings on it. This is some of the strongest memorializing they've done on the Unus Annus channel itself, but Mark and Ethan also remember Unus Annus on their own channels. On November 14th, 2021, they each made videos in remembrance, and then again on November 13th, 2022, and again on November 21st, 2023. They don't want to forget, but that doesn't mean they don't have closure on the project. Number 3, forgetting. This is about removing the memory from your life to find peace. After a bad breakup, you might burn all of the love letters that your ex gave you. Getting rid of painful reminders can help us move on. Now, this is very interesting. In the entire Unus Annus catalog, I can't find a single video that's about forgetting, and I think this is extremely easy to understand. The channel is specifically about making memories, and so it's easy to argue that Mark and Ethan wouldn't want to be destructive towards any of the memories associated with the project. Number 4. Getting even. This stems from a desire to end the injustice or pain in their lives through revenge. The book specifically mentions voodoo dolls and casting spells, and I think that's super funny, so I'm going to use that as the example. Go Hex Girl. There's 2 main instances that I can remember of getting even during Unus Annus. The first is in the video Mark punishes Ethan. It's framed like an interrogation, with Mark asking Ethan about a mistake he made. Essentially, Ethan was running behind schedule, so he uploaded a video without a description or thumbnail, but he also changed the account password, so no one was able to get in and fix the video until it was already live. Mark ends the video by faux punching Ethan over and over. The other instance was during quarantine. In the video, Ethan roasts Mark for 15 minutes straight. Viewers had been complaining that Mark was always making fun of Ethan and being mean to him, so this video turns the tables. Because Mark and Ethan seemingly have no real dislike of each other, these instances of getting even are framed comedically. Nevertheless, they would still experience a real emotional catharsis for this kind of closure. 5. Knowing. If you're tortured by the idea of unanswered questions, this is the type of closure for you. There's a minimal instance of this kind of closure in We Take a Lie Detector Test to Uncover Our Darkest Sins. We get the answers to some personal questions asked to both Mark and Ethan, but it's nothing too earth-shattering. The video I find more interesting is Was 2020 a Bad Year for Unus Annus? Mark and Ethan have a frank conversation about how the pandemic impacted their ideas and plans for Unus Annus, and even though they were upset by the limitations the quarantine placed on them, they don't regret when Unus Annus happened. Some commenters were suggesting that they extend the project to make up for the quarantine, and this video shut that down handily. They provided the audience with this type of closure and told them that this was the way things happened. It's the knowledge that they wouldn't have changed this outcome even if they could. 6. Confessing or forgiving. So confessing can cause an emotional release of guilt or shame, leading to a sense of emotional closure. Similarly, receiving forgiveness helps find closure by ending anger. There was the Unus Annus confessional booth where participants could come to Mark and Ethan and confess their sins and they would be absolved. As for Mark and Ethan confessing their own sins, there were a few videos subtitled with "Amy, don't watch this." Amy is Mark's partner, and they didn't want her to watch the videos because they were destroying the house in various ways. As the audience, we of course were able to see Amy's reaction to what Mark and Ethan had done.
Oh yeah, I forgot about that.
Welcome home!
Completing this saga and causing the closure we had sought. I highly doubt any of this was intentional, but it just goes to show what an excellent experiment Unus Annus was and how closely it really aligned with these psychological theories. Our need for closure can affect how we search for information, and when we discover it, how we process that information. Interestingly, in more ambiguous social situations, need for cognitive closure can actually make us more bigoted and prone to falling for stereotypes. Because of the urgency tendency and the permanence tendency, people can make snap judgments and be unwilling to part with that information and re-enter a state of ambiguity. Kurglansky and Webster talk about this concept they label as seize and freeze. When we feel pressured to achieve closure, we're more likely to fall victim to these two tendencies, the urgency tendency and the permanence tendency. Urgency, or the seize part of seize and freeze, is the inclination to desire closure immediately. Permanence, or the freeze part, is in reference to the desire to remain in a state of closure. There is a not insignificant portion of the Unus Annus fanbase that never went back after the channel died. They didn't look at any Unus Annus compilations or memes. They perpetuated their closure to this day. The need for closure is, interestingly, not exclusively psychological. Our bodies have a physiological response to the pressing urge for closure, like an increase in heart rate, blood pressure, and overall physiological arousal. Not like that, you degenerate. It can also adversely impact our mental health, leading to feelings of depression and anxiety when faced with decisions. There's research to suggest that time pressure heightens the need for closure. If you only have a few hours to make a decision, you are more likely to desire solidified answers than ambiguous ones. We are also much more likely to seek closure when we are uncomfortable, when we're fatigued, surrounded by environmental noise, or bored. It seems a bit strange to say that some people avoid closure, but when we think about it in terms of Unus Annus, it does make a lot of sense. We were presented with the idea of a specific end date, and yet many accounts try to archive the videos, and in some corners of the internet, they are successful. But the reasons we may have for avoiding closure can be related to our worries about making mistakes or our validity. An article by Kruglansky and Webster about closure states that when individuals may be motivated to postpone closure, and in extreme cases, to avoid it altogether. This is not inevitable, however. If a particular closure appears valid beyond the shadow of a doubt, e.g. because of the impeccable credibility of its source, the fear of invalidity may increase the tendency to embrace it rather than prompting its avoidance or postponement. Thus, closure avoidance should be conceptually distinguished from fear of invalidity. Now, I'm not some fancy big-talking academic, but I believe I understand what they're trying to say. When people are concerned about whether or not something is correct or good, they might delay or avoid making a decision. However, if the information they're receiving about that decision is highly credible, their fear might actually make them more likely to accept it. This is written about in the context of decision making, but I feel like it can be applied to the structure of Unus Annus. The decision in question here is truly the acceptance of the end. The fear of that ending created a barrier in the minds of some, or more plainly put, denial. In others, it created an unassailable truth. This will be the ending, and the acceptance was much easier for them. There's also the fact that people are more likely to delay closure when the task is intrinsically fun. It's inarguable that Unus Annus was an entertaining concept, and so it makes sense that people would want to avoid that end because it would be a termination of a pleasurable activity. I'd also like to discuss briefly the idea of decision sidestepping when it comes to media consumption. It's not a very complicated tendency, it's simply the tendency to bypass the decision-making process by relying on a collection of precedents, as described in a paper by Otto et al. This isn't a conclusion that they came to in their paper, but I want to utilize their research to propose a different point. Specifically, the idea of inaction inertia. That basically means nothing changes if nothing changes. If you watch a specific YouTuber every day, unless something changes with you or their content, you are quite likely to continue watching them. I think Unus Annus did something really interesting in regards to inaction in its viewers. They created challenges every few videos to engage and highlight their viewers. Bodice Honest, for example, was a challenge for viewers to do body painting, and Lattes Honest was the same, but for latte art. These activities encourage viewers to become participants in the channel, and therefore interrupt their inaction on a basic level. Unus Annus also interrupted that inaction inertia on a larger scale with the deletion of their channel. You can't watch what's not there. Dr. Boss argues, in The Myth of Closure, that what people really want, rather than finality, is clarity. People want to know with certainty what their loss is, and I think in this way I can agree with Dr. Boss in that we don't truly have closure from Unus Annus, but we do have exact clarity in what we've lost. Not closure on the feelings, but closure on the ambiguity. There's a type of loss called ambiguous loss. In much of my research, this was brought forward in the context of a loved one that becomes a missing person and is never found. Unus Annus was not that. Unus Annus was a loss. And furthermore, it was an anticipated one. Which brings me to the idea of anticipatory grief. In a review by authors Sweeting and Gihuli, anticipatory grief is defined as a grief occurring prior to a loss, distinguished from grief occurring at or after a loss. Shore et al. Describes anticipatory grief as a range of intensified emotional responses that may include separation anxiety, existential aloneness, denial, sadness, disappointment, anger, resentment, guilt, exhaustion, and desperation. The idea was first put forward by psychologist Lindemann during the Second World War. The wives of soldiers would go through their grieving process while their husband was away fighting, and occasionally they would come to such a strong acceptance of their spouse's death, which hadn't actually happened yet, that when the soldier finally returned home, they were rejected by their spouse. A similar phenomenon can be found in the families of those returning from jail or long hospital stays. One of the most studied aspects of anticipatory grief grief is in the realm of terminal illness. Much of the information available comes from the studies of parents of children with terminal illness. Multiple researchers observed a pattern of parents initially experiencing intense denial, usually an emotional denial rather than an intellectual one, followed by anger towards the doctors and physicians. Eventually, these parents would arrive at a feeling of grim acceptance, some even wishing for their child's death to end their suffering. I'm sorry, this section is really dark. Sorry. Of course, in many cases, there was both an anticipatory grief and a subsequent grieving process. It's not like these parents were totally accepting of their child's passing. Interestingly, it seems like many parents reported that the actual death of the child was not the most significant moment in their grieving journey. Rather, the diagnosis was equated with the death of the child, and it was associated with the beginning of their grieving process. It could be argued, then, that the moment of the death of the channel Unus Annus was not the beginning of the grieving process. It would have begun from the very first video. Many of these studies clearly associate the parents' reactions with the 5 stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. This paper mentions another study by Bowlby called The Processes of Mourning. It suggests that there are 3 primary stages of grief. 1. The urge to recover, which is characterized by want, searching behavior, and outbursts of anger. 2. Disorganization and despair, categorized by restless, apathetic behavior. And 3. Reorganization and resumption of life, which is pretty self-explanatory. Bowlby describes these phases as very liquid, flowing and ebbing and mixing into each other throughout the grieving process. Kubler-Ross interviewed the terminal patients themselves, and she coined the classic 5 stages of grief. It could be argued in this case that this is either anticipatory grief because the patient is not yet dead, or it is subsequent grief in the same way the parents in the previous example viewed the diagnosis as the death. At this point, I believe the distinction is splitting hairs, but academics really love to argue about this topic. Another researcher, Aldrich, attempts to define the difference between subsequent grief and anticipatory grief. Because anticipatory grief has an endpoint, it is fundamentally different from post-death grief, which can, theoretically, last infinitely. Additionally, because of the potential effects it might have on the patient, it's common for a relative to deny their grief more strongly and at more phases of the process to not upset their relative. Anticipatory grief can also include a phase of hopefulness that can cause backsliding in the grieving process. But how does anticipatory grief affect us? Does it make it easier to move on? That seems to be a complicated answer, like just about everything I've read on the subject. From what I'm able to conclude, if your loved one dies, after 2 hours or 2 years, you're going to be sad. Some studies find no statistical difference between bereavement of those who suffered anticipatory grief and those who didn't, but some studies have discovered a possible link. In the Harvard bereavement study, those who lost a spouse with less than 2 weeks of mourning were more likely to express disbelief at the news, experience and exhibit depression, anxiety, anger, and 2 to 4 years after bereavement, they were more likely to be unable to accept the death. It's important to state that the authors of this study, Parks and Weiss, don't necessarily view these results as confirmation of the effectiveness of anticipatory grief. It's possible that the unanticipated death is simply more traumatic. It's generally agreed that anticipatory grief doesn't completely eliminate the post-incident grief, but it can give the person the time to develop coping skills that can lessen the impact of grief on function. Therese Rando is a researcher who more recently studied the effects of anticipatory grief on parents in regards to their children. She concluded that anticipatory grief is important in the case of terminal illness, and furthermore found that there was an ideal length of the illness to grieve. That length is somewhere between 6 and 18 months. I find it interesting considering the general topic at hand. Unus Annus's lifespan falls directly in the middle of that ideal timing. In her paper on the subject, Rando argues that anticipatory grief is possible because it's grieving the loss in the 3 time foci: the past, present, and future. So for example, an idea of past grief would be if your loved one has been experiencing chronic illness, you are grieving the person that they were in the past and the activities you could do together. As your partner gets more ill, you experience grief in the present, like further debilitation, uncertainty, decrease of control, etc. It's slipping away from you right now. Finally, you grieve for the future. Maybe your partner can't take your yearly vacation this year because they're bedbound. Maybe you'll be economically uncertain because you relied on their paycheck. I remember grieving Unus Annus in all 3 times. I would watch a video and laugh, and then think about the last time the same comedy bit cracked me up and feel a pang at the idea that it would be gone soon. I would watch a video and Mark and Ethan would remind me that it would be gone forever. I would think about the future where Unus Annus didn't exist, and I couldn't ever show a video to a friend I thought who would enjoy it. There's a misconception misconception in academic circles that grieving for someone, and specifically anticipatory grief, necessitates an emotional separation from them in advance. I don't think this is true at all. Though we grieved Unus Annus in advance, it didn't stop us from becoming emotionally invested in the channel and the content. Rando argues that the decathexis must occur. However, it is not decathexis from the actual person that is to be undertaken, but rather decathexis from the hopes, dreams, and expectations of a long-term future with that person, and for that person. The future can be grieved without relinquishing the present. Reynolds and Botha wrote about the beneficial outcomes of anticipatory grief in their 2006 paper on the subject. Within the paradigm of anticipatory grief, the bereaved are able to deal with any unfinished business, say their goodbyes, clarify any misunderstandings, and prepare for the social adjustments to come, thereby having a less distressful and disabling period of bereavement when the death does occur. I believe we got to experience all of that, and then the channel died. Grief. Whether we experienced anticipatory grief about the demise of Unus Annus or not, we still experienced grief as a whole. In her book, Closure, The Rush to End Grief and What It Costs Us, Burns notes, the concept of closure has also benefited from a culture in which the focus on people's grief is common, but mostly constrained by limited patience and expectations that the person will solve the problem within a brief amount of time, without much discussion of the actual pain, and with a relatively quick resolution so that bystanders can assume the person is moving on. American culture is very repressed when it comes to grieving. It's something to be dealt with rather than felt, and it's especially not meant to be displayed. In The Unknown Country, Death in Australia, Britain, and the USA, the authors discuss the way in which the American way of grieving can lead to a loss of self. Though comparatively to other Western cultures, Americans can appear more open emotionally, it's not generally with emotions that can make us appear weak. Americans value order and control of oneself. Grief is to be borne alone, without inconveniencing other people. In case you forgot what happened in 2020, we were experiencing a pandemic, the likes of which we hadn't seen since 1918. We were grieving as a country for something that was so unexpected, it was almost a shock of cold water to the system. In many ways, COVID was a really strange time for Unus Annus. We were all shocked and afraid, and some people used this fear to urge Mark and Ethan to continue Unus Annus for another year. But it still ended on time. I feel like in some ways, the smaller grief of losing Unus Annus helped us cope with the larger grief of the pandemic. Grief can change your perception of yourself as a person, including the relationships we have with our social circles. Unus Annus created a massive social circle centered around the loss we would all experience in a year, taking grief from an isolated experience to a communal one. There's also a phenomenon that occurs after a loss called a shift in reality. If your reality for a year was tuning in every day to watch Unus Annus and then it's gone, your reality changes. If you considered yourself an Unus Annus fan and then it's gone, your reality has shifted, and that part of you has become undefined. With the community, we existed in a shared reality that experienced a seismic shift. However, there was a collectivism to our feeling, and there was a huge outpouring of art, music, writing, and inspired creators celebrating the life of the channel. Burns writes, and that is the paradox of feeling and facing grief. Out of the resolution of grief can come a tremendous blossoming of confidence, of competence, and of compassion. Through experiencing deep grief, the bereaved may gain amazing strength and wisdom. The way most YouTube channels end is not with a definitive loss, but instead an ambiguous one. The lack of finality creates a complicated kind of grief because of the lack of resolution. It's hard to properly grieve for these channels because there was no singular moment that felt like an ending, a resolution. There was no collective grief and support from the community. You didn't know it was your last time watching them, so you couldn't prepare. Ambiguous loss can lead to a rise in anxiety. It can cause some level of immobilization. Viewers might see the situation differently amongst themselves and argue about their perception of the creator's end. In cases of extreme fandom, the audience might have to restructure part of their identity. This was not ambiguous. It's gone. Varga and Gallagher have a quote about grief in their 2020 paper I feel is relevant, but it is important to note that the loss of opportunities has to involve some sense of irreplaceability. Unus Annus is irreplaceable, both in a direct literal sense and a metaphorical sense. The videos themselves are gone, and even though there are archived versions in some corners of the internet, that's not a replacement for them. The channel is gone. We've lost the opportunity for more content, but we've also lost the opportunity to return and feel nostalgic. It's a loss. It was finite, but that doesn't mean it was meaningless. In another 2020 paper, Plant says this, but this, he assures us, is no reason for despair. Why not? Because each of us leaves in our wake innumerable posthumous traces, or ripples, and this fact alone provides a potent answer to those who claim that meaninglessness and terror inevitably flow from one's finiteness. Conclusion. It's undeniable that I had to watch through Unus Annus videos again to make this video. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. I thought I would be extremely excited to go back and watch them all again and have the same great time I did before. While it was fun, and I did still enjoy my watch through quite a lot, it felt different. I am not the same person I was when I was watching Unus Annus for the first time. It felt different, more sad, and somehow it felt more final. I didn't think I had fully processed the grief of losing Unus Annus. I thought I would always want to go back and see more and wish that the channel hadn't been deleted. But watching through the archives, I felt a sense of closure. It felt like hanging out with friends from your high school. There's an undeniable love there, but you know that this is the last time. You laugh and reminisce about old times, but you can finally say those times are gone. This is the last time I'm going to watch any videos from Unus Annus. I think after 5 years, I'm finally ready to let go. I won't miss them. Not in the same way I did before. I might occasionally think about Unus Annus, about the times and bits I enjoyed, but I don't want to go back to those days anymore. I'm 5 years older than when Unus Annus began. I've graduated from university twice. I've moved in with my partner of almost 5 years. My dog from that time passed away. I've moved on, and I think the internet has moved on, but it meant something to us. Unus Annus will always be an iconic part of history, but it's history. It's over. I accept it. All things must end. Momento Mori. I hope you enjoyed this long Unus Annus retrospective. If you liked it, don't forget to leave me a like, and if you want to see more like this, subscribe and comment down below. I'll make some more interesting commentary videos soon. Follow me on all my other social media. I am Afterplague pretty much everywhere. That would be Instagram, that would be TikTok, that would be Twitch, that would be Threads, and I am after_plague on Twitter. Don't forget to check out my shop. I've got all sorts of fun stuff there, stickers coming out soon. I've got my books there, that's afterplagueart.myshopify.com. Thank you again so much for watching. Memento Mori.